What if I told you that the entire American Revolution was saved not by generals, not by governments, and not by a trained army, but by a group of farmers and hunters who had never worn a uniform in their lives? And what if the man who almost ended it all was the same man who once had George Washington in his rifle sights and chose to let him ride away? On the morning of the 7th of October, 1780, a British officer stood on a rocky ridge in South Carolina and made a declaration that would go down in history as one of the most catastrophic miscalculations of the entire Revolutionary War. He had arrived at a narrow hilltop called King's Mountain, and he told his officers with complete confidence that he was on King's Mountain, that he could not be driven from it, and that God Almighty himself could not drive him from it. He had every reason to believe that. He was considered one of the finest marksmen in the entire British Army. He had personally invented a breech-loading rifle that was decades ahead of its time. He had trained over 1,000 loyalist militia to fight with bayonet discipline. He had spent months terrorizing the Carolina backcountry and had never once lost a battle. 65 minutes later, he was dead. His entire army of over 1,100 men was killed, wounded, or captured. Not a single organized unit escaped. And the force that did it had no uniforms, no formal military training, and no orders from anyone in the Continental Army. If you have never heard the full story of what happened at King's Mountain, I want you to stay with me, because this is not just a war story. This is the story of what happens when ordinary people are pushed past the point of fear, when a threat to their families becomes more powerful than any army on earth, and when the course of history turns on a single rocky ridge in the Carolina wilderness. Welcome back to the channel, and if this is your first time here, I am glad you found us. If you enjoy stories like this one, stories about the moments in American history that most textbooks rush past, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now, because we have a lot more where this came from. Now, to understand why King's Mountain mattered so much, you have to understand just how desperate the situation was in the summer of 1780. And I mean desperate, in a way that most Americans today have never fully appreciated. By that point, the British had completely shifted their strategy. After years of grinding, inconclusive warfare in the northern colonies, the Crown decided to take the war south, and for a while, it worked brilliantly. In May of 1780, British forces surrounded Charleston, South Carolina, by land and sea, and cut off every possible escape route. The American defenders held out for weeks, but the noose tightened every day. Artillery pounded the city. Supply ships could not get through. Smallpox broke out among the troops inside the walls. On May 12th, the entire American garrison surrendered. Over 5,000 Continental soldiers lost in a single stroke. It was the largest American military surrender of the entire Revolutionary War, and it would remain the worst American military disaster until the fall of Bataan in 1942. That is not a small comparison. That is how catastrophic Charleston was. And the British were not finished. Just 3 months later, in August of 1780, they met what remained of the Southern Continental Army at Camden, South Carolina. The American commander there was a celebrated general, the hero of Saratoga, the man who had captured an entire British army in the north. At Camden, his militia broke and ran almost immediately. His Continental soldiers who stood and fought were overwhelmed. Nearly 1,000 Americans were killed or captured. And the general himself fled the battlefield on horseback and did not stop riding for nearly 60 miles. His military career was finished. After Camden, organized American resistance in the South effectively collapsed. There was no Continental Army left to speak of below Virginia. This is the moment Patrick Ferguson enters the picture, and I want you to pay close attention here, because Ferguson is not a simple villain. He was genuinely one of the most talented military officers the British Army produced during the entire war. He was a 36-year-old Scottish officer, ambitious and skilled in exactly the way that Lord Cornwallis needed for the job of pacifying the Carolina backcountry. His task was to recruit loyalist militia, train them, arm them, and use them to suppress rebel activity while Cornwallis drove north toward Virginia. But here is what most people do not know about Ferguson. Before he ever set foot in the Carolinas, he had already changed the course of the war in a way nobody recognized at the time. In 1776, he invented a breech-loading rifle that was the finest individual firearm used in the entire Revolutionary War, capable of firing 6 rounds per minute, a generation ahead of anything else on the battlefield. Only about 100 of them were ever produced because British military commanders considered the weapon too expensive. Today, only 5 of those rifles are known to exist in the United States. But that same man, with that same rifle, had George Washington in his sights at the Battle of Brandywine in 1777 and chose not to pull the trigger because he believed it was beneath the honor of a British officer to shoot an unsuspecting man in the back. 3 years later, that same code of honor would cost Ferguson his life on a hilltop in South Carolina. By late September of 1780, Ferguson had pushed deep into western North Carolina with a force of roughly 1,100 loyalist militiamen. He had turned farmers and shopkeepers into something resembling professional soldiers. He believed they were ready for anything. And then he made the mistake that would destroy everything he had built. He sent a message across the mountains. West of the Blue Ridge Mountains, in the river valleys of what is now eastern Tennessee, there lived a collection of frontier families that Ferguson had fundamentally misread. And that misreading would cost him everything. These were the Overmountain men. They were not soldiers in any formal sense of the word. They were farmers, hunters, and Indian fighters who had carved their existence out of the wilderness with long rifles, hatchets, and sheer determination. They had settled land that was technically still claimed by the Cherokee, and they had spent years defending their homesteads against raids that most people living on the coast could not even imagine. They answered to no colonial government. Many of them had ignored the entire revolution up to this point, not because they did not care about liberty, but because the war had not yet crossed into their lives. Ferguson changed that the moment he sent his message. His ultimatum was blunt and deliberately terrifying. If the settlers did not stop their opposition to the crown, he would cross the mountains himself, hang their leaders, and lay waste to their settlements with fire and sword. Ferguson intended that threat to intimidate. Instead, it did something he never anticipated. It unified people who had never agreed on anything before, and it turned men who had stayed out of the war into the most dangerous fighting force the British would face in the entire Southern campaign. Now I want you to understand something about who these men actually were, because this is the part that most tellings of this story get wrong. The Overmountain men were not backwoods rabble. Many of them were Scots-Irish Presbyterians, descended from people who had survived centuries of conflict in Ulster, Ireland, before crossing the Atlantic and pushing further west than any other settlers in America. They had developed a culture built entirely around self-reliance, community loyalty, and the ability to fight on terrain that would stop a professional army cold. They did not follow orders from distant governments. They followed men they personally trusted, men they had hunted with, prayed with, and built cabins alongside. And here is a detail I find remarkable every time I think about it. Among the men who answered the call and marched to Kings Mountain was a frontier settler named John Crockett. His son, born a few years later, would grow up to become one of the most legendary figures in American history. Davy Crockett's father stood on that ridge. Word of Ferguson's threat spread through the mountain settlements like fire through dry grass. Within days, riders went out across the valleys carrying the call to muster. On the 25th of September 1780, the Overmountain men gathered at Sycamore Shoals on the Watauga River at the site of present-day Elizabethton, Tennessee. They came from settlements scattered across hundreds of miles of wilderness. Some rode horses, some walked. Some brought their own rifles and powder. Others had almost nothing. Before they marched out, a Presbyterian minister named Reverend Samuel Doak addressed the gathered men and delivered a sermon that ended with a phrase from the Old Testament. "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." The men took it as their battle cry, and then they crossed the mountains. The march itself was brutal in a way that is hard to fully communicate. They pushed through the Blue Ridge passes in late September rain and early autumn cold. No tents. No fires at night because the wood was too wet to burn. Some of the men had no shoes. They slept on the ground in their hunting shirts, soaked to the skin. They covered ground at a pace that would have impressed professional soldiers, pushing through mountain gaps that most armies would have considered impassable. Nobody turned back. By October 6th, after picking up additional men along the way, including 350 fighters under Colonel Benjamin Cleveland, a man so large and physically imposing that his horse deserved its own medal for endurance, the combined Patriot force had grown to roughly 1,400 men. But they had a problem. Ferguson was moving, and if he reached Cornwallis in Charlotte, it would all be over. Cornwallis had 6,000 battle-hardened professional British soldiers waiting there. If Ferguson made it to that protection, there was nothing anyone could do to reach him. So the Patriot colonels made a decision that would define everything that followed. They selected the 900 best marksmen on the 900 strongest horses and sent them riding through the night, 35 miles in the cold rain, to find Ferguson before dawn and close the distance before he could escape. It was a gamble that had no safety net, and not a single man turned his horse around. By the morning of the 7th of October, 1780, the rain had stopped, but a thick fog still clung to the valleys and ridgelines of the Carolina backcountry. The 900 riders had pushed through the night without rest, and now, through a combination of local scouts and a captured loyalist who could not keep his mouth shut, they had exactly the intelligence they needed. Ferguson had made camp on a narrow forested ridge called King's Mountain, about 16 miles south of the present-day North Carolina border. And here is where the story takes a turn that no military strategist could have predicted, because the position Ferguson had chosen with such absolute confidence was not a fortress. It was a death trap, and he could not see it. King's Mountain rose only about 60 feet above the surrounding terrain and stretched roughly 600 yards in length. The top was relatively flat, shaped something like a footprint, narrow at the northeastern end and wider at the southwest. And here is the critical detail that Ferguson missed entirely. The hardwood trees and thick underbrush covering those slopes did not provide cover for his defenders. They provided cover for the attackers climbing up. Ferguson had not added any fortifications because he did not believe he needed them. He told his officers that he was on King's Mountain and that God Almighty himself could not drive him from it. He was about to find out how wrong that confidence could be. The Patriot colonels arrived near King's Mountain around 3 in the afternoon. They dismounted, tied their horses, and formed into columns. There was no elaborate battle plan. The strategy was almost brutally simple. Surround the mountain from all sides and attack uphill simultaneously. Every man was instructed to act as his own captain, to use every advantage the terrain offered, and to keep climbing no matter what came down the slope at him. At roughly 3:15 in the afternoon, the attack began. And what happened next is one of the most remarkable 65 minutes in American military history. The over-mountain men moved through the trees like hunters stalking game, because that is exactly what they were. These were men who had spent their entire lives reading terrain, moving quietly through dense forest, and putting rifle balls precisely where they intended. And the weapons they carried gave them an advantage that was almost unfair. Their long rifles were accurate at ranges of 200 to 300 yards. The loyalist troops on the summit were armed primarily with smoothbore muskets, effective to maybe 80 yards. The mathematics of that engagement were devastating before the first shot was ever fired. When the rifle fire erupted from every direction simultaneously, Ferguson's men responded the only way they had been trained to respond. They formed lines and launched bayonet charges down the slopes. And at first, those charges worked. The Overmountain men had no bayonets, and when a wall of loyalists came crashing downhill with fixed steel, the frontiersmen fell back into the trees. But they did not break. They did not run. They melted into the forest, reloaded, and came right back up. Think about what that means for a moment. A conventional army facing a disciplined bayonet charge without bayonets of their own should have disintegrated. That is how 18th century warfare worked. But every time Ferguson's men charged downhill and gained ground on one side of the mountain, they exposed themselves to rifle fire from the Patriots on the opposite slopes. Then when they wheeled around to face that fire, the men they had just pushed back would creep up the hill again behind them. It was like trying to hold back the tide with your hands. Every charge solved one problem and instantly created three more. The fighting grew savage and close. The mountain was shrouded in black powder smoke. Men shouted, screamed, and cursed in every direction. At certain points, the opposing forces were so close together that they were fighting hand-to-hand with rifle butts, knives, and bare fists. Through all of it, Ferguson rode back and forth across the hilltop on horseback, blowing a silver whistle to rally his men, personally leading counterattacks wherever the line seemed weakest. He was conspicuously brave, wearing a checkered hunting shirt over his uniform that made him impossible to miss. His sword was shot from his hand. He kept fighting with his left. His hat was shot off. He replaced it and kept riding. But the perimeter was shrinking with every passing minute, and the white flags were starting to appear among his men. Ferguson rode to every one of them and cut them down with his sword. He refused to surrender to what he called a band of bandits, and so the killing continued. Then, sometime around 4 in the afternoon, Ferguson made his final decision. He gathered a small group of officers and attempted to break through the Patriot lines on horseback, apparently hoping to cut his way to freedom and ride for Cornwallis. He charged downhill toward the southeastern slope, sword raised, silver whistle still blowing. He never made it. Multiple rifle balls struck him almost simultaneously. His foot caught in his stirrup as he fell, and his horse dragged his body across the rocky ground before finally coming to a stop. The finest marksman in the British Army, the man who had threatened to lay waste to the mountains, was dead. And with him went any last hope his men had of holding that ridge. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Of Ferguson's force of approximately 1,000, 100 men, 290 were killed, 163 were wounded, and 668 were taken prisoner. The entire army. Every single man was killed, wounded, or captured. Not one organized unit escaped. The Patriot losses were 28 killed and 62 wounded. 900 frontier riflemen had surrounded a fortified hilltop, defended by over 1,000 disciplined troops, attacked uphill from every direction, and annihilated the entire enemy force in just over an hour while losing fewer than 100 men themselves. If you wrote that as fiction, no publisher on earth would believe it. Now here is where I want you to slow down and really absorb what happened next, because the battle itself is only half the story. What Kings Mountain set in motion is the part that most people never fully connect to what they learned in school. When Lord Cornwallis received word of what happened on that ridge, he was stunned. He had been preparing to march north into North Carolina, continuing the campaign to roll up the southern colonies one by one. Ferguson's force had been protecting his entire western flank. Now that flank was gone, along with 1,100 trained soldiers he could not replace. Cornwallis immediately halted his advance and retreated south to Winnsboro, South Carolina. He would stay there for nearly 3 months. And here is a detail that I think deserves a moment of silence. Ferguson had sent a message to Cornwallis requesting reinforcements before the battle. That message did not reach Cornwallis until one day after Ferguson was already dead. The fate of 1,100 men was sealed by a single day's delay in communication. But the consequences went far deeper than one retreat. Loyalist recruitment across the Carolinas collapsed almost immediately after Kings Mountain. Men who had been considering joining the British cause looked at what happened on that ridge and decided to stay home. The Loyalist militia network that the entire British Southern strategy depended on began to crumble from within. At the same time, Patriot morale surged across the Southern colonies in a way that had not been seen since before Charleston fell. Men who had given up on the Revolution picked up their rifles again. General George Washington himself wrote to his army that the determined volunteers who crossed those mountains were proof of the spirit and resources of the country. The 3 months that Kings Mountain cost Cornwallis were 3 months the American cause desperately needed. In December of 1780, Congress appointed a new commander for the Southern Theater, General Nathaniel Greene, arguably the most talented strategic mind in the entire Continental Army. Greene understood that he did not need to win pitched battles. He just needed to keep the British chasing him, stretching their supply lines thinner and thinner. Without Kings Mountain, Greene might never have gotten that chance. And the domino effect from that single October afternoon is almost impossible to overstate. Kings Mountain led directly to Cowpens in January of 1781, where the British light infantry was effectively destroyed. Cowpens led to Guilford Courthouse in March of 1781, a victory so costly for Cornwallis that it broke his army's ability to sustain the campaign. And Guilford Courthouse led Cornwallis to make a decision that defied direct orders from his own commander, abandoning the Carolinas entirely and marching north into Virginia, straight into the trap that was waiting for him at Yorktown in October of 1781, exactly 1 year to the month after Kings Mountain. Now I want to bring you back to something I mentioned at the beginning, because it matters more at the end of this story than it did at the start. Patrick Ferguson, the man who died on that ridge, was the same officer who had George Washington in his rifle sights at Brandywine in 1777 and chose not to fire, because he believed it was beneath his honor to shoot an unsuspecting man in the back. He let Washington ride away. And 3 years later, that same personal code of honor, that same refusal to accept a result that felt beneath his dignity as a gentleman officer, was the thing that killed him. He cut down every white flag his own men raised. He refused to surrender to men he considered beneath his station. And so the killing continued until there was nothing left to save. The same principle that spared the father of our nation ultimately ended the man who spared him. Thomas Jefferson called Kings Mountain the turn of the tide of success in the South. President Herbert Hoover, speaking before a crowd of 70,000 to 75,000 people at the battlefield in 1930 on the 150th anniversary, said it plainly. He called it a small army and a little battle, but one of mighty portent, and said that history had done scant justice to its significance, which rightly should place it beside Lexington, Bunker Hill, Trenton, and Yorktown as one of the crucial engagements in our long struggle for independence. Many of the over-mountain men simply went home after the battle, melting back into the mountains as quietly as they had come. They had done what they came to do. Among them was a man named John Crockett, whose son would one day become one of the most legendary figures in American frontier history. John Sevier and Isaac Shelby went on to help build the state of Tennessee. The foothold those men established on the frontier helped open the door to the great westward expansion that would define the next century of American life. There is a granite obelisk at Kings Mountain today. The ridge is quiet now, covered in the same hardwood forest that sheltered those riflemen almost 250 years ago. Most Americans have never heard the full story of what happened there. But the men who fought the Revolution understood exactly what it meant. It was the moment when free people, with no uniforms, no orders, and no certainty of survival, decided that a threat to their families was reason enough to change the course of history. That idea did not start at Kings Mountain, and it did not end there. But on that October afternoon in 1780, it stopped being just an idea. It became a fact carved into that rocky Carolina ridge, and it has never stopped being true. If this story moved you the way it moves me every time I go back to it, drop a comment below and tell me what part hit you hardest. And if you found this worth your time, a like and a subscription go a long way toward helping us keep telling stories like this one.